Hey there, FUMC Tupelo. My name is Sam Blades, and I am an intern at the church this summer. I am so grateful to be partnering with you all, and I'm excited to be here today. So, let's get started. To begin, I want us to think about the way that predictions influence how we live. We rely on predictions for a lot of things. Every day we rely on the weatherman to give us an accurate prediction of what the temperature is going to be or if it's going to rain or not. When I need to go somewhere, I just hop in my car and I go. I don't check all the parts every time I need to drive. I just expect and predict that the car will work like it usually does. Even simple plans like meeting a friend for coffee are based on certain predictions. You predict that the coffee shop will be open in the same hours that they say they'll be open, and you predict that your friend will meet you at the time that you agreed on. And so much of our lives are based on predictions. And that's good. Good predictions help us to anticipate and expect what the future might have in store for us. But even the best and most careful predictions can fail us. I'm sure we've all been bamboozled by the weatherman, and reliable cars break down, and reliable friends show up late for coffee. So predictions shape our everyday life, but they leave us wanting something more. We can plan and try to predict the future as much as we want, but our predictions will always fall short. We're left wanting something more definite and sure, and something that won't let us down. In a world of predictions, we're left wanting a promise. Today we will be focusing on God's promise to bless Abraham and to bless the nations through the birth of Abraham's son. We will begin reading from Genesis 18, but before that, a little backstory. So in chapter 12, God speaks to Abraham and he promises to bless him, to make him into a great nation. God speaks to him again in chapter 15, but this time Abraham asks, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless?" And to this question, God responds, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. So shall your offspring be." Abraham says, "Look, I know you said you would bless me. I know we talked about this blessing and the making me into a great nation, but I still don't have a son. How is this supposed to work out?" But God promises that the blessing and the making of Abraham into a great nation would all come about through Abraham's own offspring. "Look at the stars, so shall your offspring be." However, things get complicated when Abraham has a son with his wife's servant. Sarah, his wife, says, "I'm too old to have children. If God has promised you offspring, then you need to have a son with someone else." And Abraham agrees to this, so we get Ishmael born via Hagar. Instead of trusting that God would bring about offspring through Sarah, Abraham and Sarah take matters into their own hands. And so, after all of this, we come to Genesis 18, beginning with verse 1. "The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground." Pause right there for just a second. The Lord appeared to Abraham. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men. So in some way, God is speaking and appearing to Abraham through these 3 men. We keep reading in verses 3 through 8, tell us how Abraham went out of his way to treat these men with hospitality, and he prepared a very fine meal for them. Pick up in verse 9. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I'm worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh. I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son." This is not a prediction. God is not saying, "I've crunched the numbers, and it looks like you, Sarah, a 99-year-old woman, are going to have a son. No. He says, surely you will have a son. This is language of a promise. And in response, Sarah does what any of us in her situation would do. She laughs. I'm old. My husband is old. I'm worn out and past the age of childbearing. And yet here you are promising me that I'll have a son. Ha! To predict the impossible is ridiculous enough, but to promise the impossible is laughable. And so Sarah laughs. But despite all the laughter, both Sarah and Abraham are faced with this question: is anything too hard for the Lord? The Lord says to them, despite your doubt, even though what I'm promising is impossible, will you trust that I am able and faithful to accomplish and fulfill everything exactly as I promise? Is there any promise that I cannot fulfill? Is anything too hard for the Lord? Is anything too hard for the Lord? Is there any promise that he will not fulfill? The answer to this promise, the answer to all of his promise, is no. Nothing is too hard for the Lord. There's no promise so crazy, so ridiculous, or so impossible that he can't fulfill it. Chapter 21. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Notice the language in verse 1. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Everything else that follows, Sarah's pregnancy and the birth of Isaac, all of it is the work of God to fulfill everything and to accomplish everything exactly as he had promised. The Lord was gracious as he had said, and the Lord did what he had promised. The birth of Isaac is not a prediction come true. It's a promise fulfilled. Abraham and Sarah are old, and they've had a lot of shortcomings. They laughed in the face of God's promise, and yet God is faithful to fulfill and to bring about everything exactly as he said. He's faithful to bless the world through their offspring. So how is it that the birth of Isaac came to be? The Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. God is the one who fulfills his promise of blessing. Abraham and Sarah are the instruments. Isaac is the one who is born, but God is the one who is at work to bring about and to fulfill everything exactly as he had promised. God is the one who is faithful to bless. The Lord was gracious as he had said, and the Lord did what he had promised. So how can we know? How can we know that God is the one who fulfills his promises? How can we know that he was faithful, that he is faithful, and that he will be faithful? How can we know? Abraham asked a similar question. And so to see this even more fully, we go back to where this promise first came from, where the promise for Abraham's offspring first originated. God says to Abraham in chapter 15, verse 7, he says, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram, he's still Abram at this point, Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? How can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer and a goat and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, "To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites." Now, this passage in Genesis 15, it's bizarre. There's a lot going on, but let's walk through it. God has just told Abraham that the blessing and the promise of offspring would come about through his own son. Look up at the stars, so shall your offspring be. So he reinforces that in verse 7, saying, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land, to take possession of it. I am the Lord. I've done great things for you. I've been faithful to you, and all of it has been for the purpose to give you this land, to make you into a great nation and give you a great name through your own offspring." But Abraham asked, "Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? How can I know that you will be faithful to accomplish everything? How can I know that you will fulfill your promises? How can I know?" So Abraham has just asked a hugely important question, and really one that the whole world, all the nations, are dependent on. How can I know that you will bless and be faithful to all nations through me? And in response to this hugely and vastly important question, God says, "Bring me a heifer. Bring me some livestock and a couple of birds." And I don't know about you, but that is not the answer that I would have expected. How can I know that you will be faithful to all generations? Bring me a heifer. But Abraham does it. He brings the animals, and then he proceeds to cut them in half, but not the birds, for some reason. So we've got God, we've got Abraham, we've got animals that are being cut in half, and we've got their pieces arranged opposite each other, making this kind of aisle or walkway or whatever it is. And if that weren't enough, Abraham now has to shoo away these birds of prey. It's all very strange. We keep reading. Abraham enters into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness comes over him. And from here, God seems to begin answering his original question. "Know for certain," he says, "that your descendants will be enslaved in a strange country, but they will come back here, and I will give them this land, as I am promising you." But as soon as this statement is made, the weirdness resumes. Verse 17, "When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces." Now at this point, you're probably asking, what on earth does this have to do with God's faithfulness? How is this even an answer to Abraham's question? What do dead animals that are chopped in half and smoking firepots have to do with Isaac and God and blessing the nations? What are we dealing with? The scene we see here is the making of a covenant. In the ancient Near East, back in the days of Abraham, two kings would do this if they wished to make an agreement or a covenant with one another. The way you formalized an agreement was by coming together. You brought animals, sacrificed them, cut them in half, arranged the pieces in this aisle, like Abraham's done, and then both parties would walk down the middle of this aisle in between the pieces of the animals. It was a way of saying, if I'm unfaithful to our agreement, if I break our covenant, let me be like these dead, chopped in half animals. It was a bit gruesome, a bit extreme for what we might expect, but it's the way of signing and guaranteeing your faithfulness to this covenant. It's the ancient equivalent of like a pinky promise or signing a contract or a legal document. So here in Genesis 15, we have the making of an ancient covenant. But the thing is, only one of the parties passes through the dead animals. Abraham is in a deep sleep. He's overcome by thick and dreadful darkness. And so only God, depicted here as a smoking firepot with a blazing torch, only God passes through the pieces. Here is God's covenant with Abraham to bring about blessing for all people. And the only person who this covenant depends on is God. God's promise to bring about blessing doesn't depend on Abraham's faithfulness. It only depends on God's faithfulness. God is both the one who promises to bless and the one who will be faithful to bring about and to ensure that the blessing that he's promised comes to be. God initiates and God fulfills. And so, the Lord was gracious as he had said, and the Lord did what he had promised. What God graciously promises, he faithfully fulfills. And this was true for Abraham and Sarah through the birth of Isaac. It's true for me and for you. What God graciously promises, he faithfully fulfills. He's a God of promise and a God of covenant. Despite Abraham and Sarah's old age, despite their disbelief and their laughter, God was faithful to bring about everything exactly as he had promised. He brings about blessing and life for all nations through them. Sarah says in chapter 21, verse 6, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Earlier, her laughter was in disbelief. Now her laughter is in joy. Earlier, she was ashamed of her laughter. She hid and she denied it. Now she shares her laughter. Everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. The whole world will share in this joy and in the blessing of God's faithfulness. The promise of Abraham's offspring is fulfilled through Isaac, but it is fulfilled ultimately and more fully in Jesus, who is the true and full descendant and offspring of Abraham. Through him, all the nations of the earth are blessed. And so what God graciously promises, he faithfully fulfills. And every fulfilled promise of God is one of blessing and joy and life in Jesus Christ. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son. Who would have said, yet I have borne him a son? No one would have predicted this, yet God has fulfilled everything exactly as he had said. Our God is not a God of predictions. He's a God of promise. And so in a world of uncertainty, in a world of forecasts and projections, would we rest knowing that God relates to us, not through predictions, but through promise. And the promise of God for all who believe is blessing, joy, and life in the name of Jesus. And everything that God graciously promises, he faithfully fulfills. Amen.